thanks to the organizers, but I just wanted to warn everybody, this is going to be completely different than what we've been hearing up till now. First caveat, no pictures. I'm sorry, not going to have any beautiful pictures, so. I've got 7 slides, they're mostly text, but I took very seriously the focus this evening on the concept of resilience. There are a lot of threads in this conference, and over the next 4 days, one of course is the idea of consciousness or the conscious cities, kind of the neuropsychology. There's also the issue of urban design. Maybe I'll come into those issues a little bit, but I'm really here to share with you some ideas about resilience. I want to make 4 main points in my short remarks today that I am hoping will kind of complexify a little bit how we think about resilience. They are, number 1, concepts matter. 2, states matter, in other words, governing institutions. 3, space matters. And 4, history matters. And in sharing these ideas in the next 10 minutes, I hope, I'm drawing on my own work as a faculty in a department of urban planning and design, so emphasize urban planning as much as design, but also my own work on urban resilience in the face of chronic violence. So I've come to the concept of resilience not necessarily through the environmental climate change issue, but through the notion of the vulnerability of everyday violence that people live in, of course, in cities like New York, Baltimore, we can name them all across the United States. I happen to work on Latin America, but in essence, I did a project when I was at MIT with Phil on urban resilience in situations of chronic violence. Last thing I want to say as a preface, I coordinate a program, a Master in Design Studies at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, titled Risk and Resilience. And what we're trying to do in that program is create a dialogue about the interrelationships or parallels across varieties of vulnerabilities at the scale of the city. So in other words, environmental vulnerability or environmental injustice is often related to vulnerability to other forms of oppression, whether it's violence, poverty, etc. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So let me start with my 4 points. The first one is the notion that concepts matter. So I want to suggest that maybe we should be thinking about risk rather than resilience. And I do that because the current preoccupation with the concept of resilience is stemming from recent programmatic endeavors, including some funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and others, to promote a new and expanding repertoire of tools using technology, reconfigured mapping, building products, et cetera, that will guide us to a secure urban and global future. But I think we would all recognize that the concept of resilience is very tricky, readily veering into the ideological. It's usually defined as the ability to cope and adapt so that individuals or communities survive in the face of danger or vulnerability, again, environmental vulnerability, other forms of danger. So in that sense, resilience is all about optimism. I'm an optimistic person too, I think. Anybody who's in a planning program is optimistic. But whether conceived in terms of bouncing back to normal after a disaster or as a means of reestablishing system equilibrium after a shock, embracing resilience means having faith that with enough attention and effort, the future can be better. However, these assumptions not only tend to ignore the interrelationships of risk or the fact that certain coping strategies may reinforce risk, either the original risk or other forms of risk, rather than protect against it. Also, in its focus on coping and adapting, resilience discourses are often too oriented towards individual agency. This not only means that they fail to take into account institutional context, particularly with respect to governance, an issue that I'm going to come back to in a moment, but it also means that to a great degree, resilience functions as an ideology that emphasizes hope and possibilities more than the structural or intractable conditions that may problematize even the most optimistic efforts to move forward. bouncing backs, citizens can manage, citizens always come together in the face of problems, etc. Now, this may be where we're thinking a little about consciousness, because I do think in some of the discussion up to now, the idea of kind of design and consciousness is all in the head and the kind of neuropsychology. But I think that we need to move beyond the individual, and that's why I move that preoccupation with individual agency as a kind of the bedrock of resilience. I think we need to look at other things besides individuals' responses, or even community agency, if we want to understand how to move forward in hopefully a more equitable and somewhat just way in the face of chronic vulnerabilities, climate-related or otherwise. So how should we think then critically? And remember, my first point is concepts matter. How should we think about that? One way to do that, I want to suggest, is to move beyond the ideological embrace of the notion of discourse. And I'm sorry, I know there are offices called the Chief Resilience Officer. We just had somebody here from the mayor's team, et cetera. But I think we need to deconstruct the notion of resilience to understand which coping and adaptation strategies might produce or reinforce risk for an individual or community, how and why, as opposed to coping strategies that lead a pathway out of risk and vulnerability. And that's why I have, in the work that we did when I was at MIT on violence, we really tried to propose 3 different ways of thinking about resilience. Because otherwise, again, we fall into the ideological notion that resilience is always a good thing. And I don't want to get into too much detail about this, because anybody who's interested can talk to me afterwards. I can give you the website to find the report, which we produced for USAID, was looking at 8 cities around the world. But the point I wanted to make is, in some places, the very same coping and adaptation strategies reinforced the power of the perpetrators of violence, as opposed to undermining it. So I want us to think about which strategies we want to pursue to look for a better future. And not all coping and adaptation strategies are going to produce the same outcome. So the second point was that states matter, our governing institutions. And I think that the other thing that we learned in our research was that we needed to understand individual, and it was really more community coping strategies in the context of their relationship with the state or local authorities, and their involvement in co-producing situations of less vulnerability. Again, a lot of this comes from my work on violence, but I think we could focus with the same lens on climate change or other poverty or other forms of vulnerability that we care about and that we expect people to be resilient in the face of. So, I mean, obviously this slide talks a little bit more about the notion that we developed called cooperative autonomy, because I don't think we're going to have top-down planning decisions that are going to create resilience, but we can't expect that communities themselves can actually solve structural problems. So it's a kind of co-production of their kind of relationship to each other that is going to produce the greatest forms of resilience, or what we would call collective efficacy. Okay, my third point, that space matters, and this is maybe where I'm getting more into the design world, a more traditional understanding of space. And we actually looked in our research at spatial interventions in communities facing chronic violence. So I'm very attuned to the role of spatial interventions and spatial strategies. But the point I want to make here today is that we have to also think about space, not in terms of spatial interventions that might create safe spaces, public realm, et cetera, push back against sea level rise, water vulnerabilities, et cetera, but also think about individual spatial interventions in the context of the city as a whole. And so what we've tried to look up at is the importance of scaling spatial strategies over spaces. So starting with creating sites of resilience, and again, these are co-produced through government and communities, that and how those sites could be networked into larger zones of resilience to create cities of resilience. And I think that sometimes when we talk about resilience, we think either we're only talking about a small scale or only about a city as a whole. We have to be paying our attention to the scaling and interrelationship between these interventions. Now, let me just say why I think space is so important in understanding resilience. And when I say space, I mean, I want us to think about the ways in which risk, remember, this is my concern as much as resilience, is unevenly distributed in space, not merely across different social groups or, for example, the poor, and a lot of the work on environmental justice focuses on the kind of particular spaces where certain residents of the city are more exposed to vulnerability than others. But we also have to understand the different types of governance spaces and the governance institutions and their uneven distribution. Government programs and government as a legitimate actor, their acceptance as legitimate actors is unevenly spread across cities. So we need to think about the spatial variation in kind of the co-production of resilience. I'd like to underscore that there may be trade-offs among forms and patterns of resilience, not just among different residents or locations in the same city, but also in terms of immediate versus long-run gains in livability, such that coping strategies in some locations or in some domains, maybe the environment, again, well, I'm interested in the conversation with different vulnerabilities, but coping strategies in some physical locations may actually reinforce the structural problems that create risks in other locations. So again, thinking about the spatial scale of the city as a whole, not only looking at an individual intervention in a particular, on a street or in a particular neighborhood. Okay, my fourth point. History matters, and I can't go into this too much here, but I think that what we found in our research was how individuals and even communities responded, how they worked or not with government authority, how they conceived of the problem of risk, had a lot to do with history. Their social history, their governing history, whether they totally lost all support or had no the government for them had no legitimacy, or even their spatial history. So I think most of us are thinking about, when we think about resilience, we think about present actions and future outcomes, but you have to take into account the past if you want to know why people will or won't respond to your programs, or whether they will engage with the government to produce greater resilience. Now, my final point, I just want to say, or a final thought. I said 4 points, but I have some final thoughts. It has to do with the notion of design thinking as a means, from my perspective, because I'm not technically an urban designer, I'm not an architect, I'm a social scientist. I want us to frame design thinking as a means to confront complexity. And I think design thinking, not just design interventions, but design thinking, actually building government programs, it requires design thinking. Anyway, design thinking can help us advance new and potentially more coordinated efforts to minimize risk and enhance resilience. And to do this, designers or design thinkers have to draw on insights from many different disciplines: history, politics, urban planning, architecture, et cetera, and so on. I want to conclude by saying that I believe that design thinking, or good design thinking, builds on the assumption that any single design project or intervention will have implications far beyond its targeted scope, both in scalar and sectoral terms. So, to enable constructive action in the context of multiplying and interconnected vulnerabilities that unfold at the local and the global scale, we must also then, so design thinking is interdisciplinarity, return to the idea of risk, and to build, design, and plan for risk than merely for resilience. And to do so will inevitably require, I don't want to go too long because we have other people, but require new guiding principles and paradigms. I'm going to skip the next paragraph, but in my own work on violence in Latin America, I found that modernist architectural and planning paradigms were the source of the problem of violence, because they created the formal city, the informal city. They created different types of spaces that separated people rather than bringing them together, and that separated land use functions, etc. So we really need to have new principles and new paradigms to deal with risk as well as resilience. Maybe flexibility is one of those concepts that we are kind of developing in the design and architectural world. How do we create spaces that have flexible uses that are not fixed in time? Because the fixity of modernism and modernist planning that created the overbuilding and the overconsumption that comes with a modernist project, whether it's cars, carbon emissions, buildings, concrete, etc., that has got us into the problems that we have. So in order to get out of them, we have to have some new design thinking and new paradigms. And I think I'll end there. Thank you.